G'day, Ian Billinghurst here. You know, the vet from down under, the vet who wrote the book Give Your Dog a Bone, all that stuff. The man who reputedly started this whole raw feeding movement. Now this all started way back in the early 90s. 1994 I produced this book. Actually it was late 1993, Give Your Dog a Bone. And by 1995, thanks to the internet, which was growing at that time, the whole idea of raw feeding had taken off. There are all these groups on the internet discussing raw because the internet at that stage had just begun its explosion of knowledge and people getting together and discussing new topics and learning from each other. In any case, as a result of that, by 1997 I'd been invited to England to talk about raw, and we spent about 3 weeks over there talking about raw. 1998 I got the call to come to America and talk about raw. Now it was over there that we spent 3 months, nearly 3 months, right across the USA talking about nothing else but raw. About 13 different seminars. Some days there were, or some weekends, mostly weekends, but sometimes during the week, and we did 1 day and 2 day seminars. And it was absolutely incredible because this was how the whole raw feeding movement took off. Now, I was trolling through my computer the other day and I came across a very early lecture from that time. I'd given this lecture maybe about halfway through this period in America, and it wasn't a 1 day and it wasn't a 2 day. It was actually for just an hour's duration. But by this time I'd managed to condense the whole idea down to just a few simple truths. Simple being the operative word. In any case, this is the lecture I'm about to present to you, and I do hope you will enjoy it, and I do thank you for watching. But the key idea here is that raw is simple, because I noticed today that there are too many gurus who want to make raw difficult. It ain't. It's not difficult. It's dead easy, and you follow the simple advice that is embodied in the whole concept of raw feeding, and your animals, your dogs, your cats, and if you learn from it, even yourself, will be supremely healthy. But the key point, nutrition. When following the raw paradigm, the evolutionary paradigm, nutrition, it is absurdly simple. Well, I make the time at 2:30 and it's time to be very afraid. Be very afraid of the raw diet. That seems to be the message I'm getting. Actually, I want you to be unafraid of the raw diet. That's why I'm here. So if you're not afraid of those seats, you want to come and sit down and we can chat about feeding dogs the Aussie way. This little section of the talk is titled The Raw Diet, and it seems to be that this is a topic in America that in some people's minds is a very dangerous topic, and in some people's minds is a very healthy topic. So I've been asked to come down here and talk to you people about this very dangerous topic, and try and dispel a few myths and fears, and try and get a few of you to start feeding your dogs this way. Now, this isn't the first time I've spoken to an American audience, and I'm really pleased to say I've got people coming up to me now and saying, yes, I have started the raw diet, and yes, my dogs love it, and no, they have not dropped dead. And I find this fabulous because I've been doing it for about 20 years, maybe longer. And my clients have been doing it for, well, probably a similar amount of time. And all we see is fabulous results. So really my message to you is do not be afraid. That's number one message. We've got a few more things to say than that. I started off not as a veterinary surgeon but as an agricultural scientist many, many years ago, and ended up in the Australian bush on a agricultural research station, and most afternoons were spent chasing rabbits with my dog. Yeah, I had a dog back then, shooting the rabbits, not the dog. And the dog would eat the rabbits, of course, and we weren't very rich in those days, so we spent most of our money for the dog's food at the butcher's, buying what turns out to be what we're calling today raw meaty bones. So our dogs back then ate bones and scraps of food, and our dogs were absurdly healthy. Oh, and of course they ate the rabbits as well. Our dogs were never vaccinated, they were never wormed, and they very regularly, they weren't desexed either, gave birth to pups. They were both our dogs were females at that time, and there was an obliging dog up the road. And every, I think it takes 9 weeks, doesn't it? She, Candy, our first dog, would give birth, well, not every 9 weeks, it took about every 6 or 7 months, and then 9 weeks later, after that visit up the road, give birth in a whelping hole, not in a whelping box, to about 6 or 7 puppies, which absolutely thrived and did beautifully. Now, I thought that was normal back then. I wasn't a veterinary surgeon or a veterinary scientist of any description. I was an agricultural graduate, and I just accepted that as the norm, but I had great aspirations to be a veterinary surgeon. During the course of my training, one of the things that really, well, one aspect of the training that impacted on my mind was the fact that towards the end of that training, an agricultural science graduate like myself was our teacher in nutrition. And this was highly disappointing to me. I'd at least expected to be taught about the nutrition of small animals by a veterinary surgeon, but here she was, a graduate in agricultural science, just like myself. And the training, the end of the training, the bottom line to the training was this, that if you want to feed your dogs properly, then feed them a processed food. That didn't really cut with me, because that's not what had done before. However, as a newly graduated veterinary surgeon, that's what I went out and taught my clients, because that's the way we had been trained. It's interesting that my own dogs began to develop numerous health problems they'd never had before. And it wasn't until I started to study acupuncture that somebody pointed out to me the problems, that I no longer fed my dogs the way I had used to feed them. So what did I do? I began reading books on the subject. I read a book by Belfield, by Pitcairn. Over the years, not all at once, I think Debunking Levy was number 1. But from that, I realised that my training at veterinary school had been somewhat deficient in the nutritional aspects, at least the practical aspects, because they had not addressed the issue of feeding what to me had been a normal way to feed a dog, on bones and scraps, and actually some fairly revolting things that dogs tend to eat as well, and that had never been addressed. So what I began to do, because my own dogs were improving in health, I began to suggest to my clients that they too should begin feeding their dogs that way. And what I discovered, much to my amazement, that many seemingly insurmountable problems, some of them small, some of them large, began to disappear. I became impressed. I became impressed at the simplicity of what I was doing and the fact that it could actually change the health of dogs simply by switching their diet. And that's what I want to talk to you about today, how you can do the same thing.
And really my aim is to convince you, and we've only got a short period of time to do this, that you too, if you're having health problems with your dogs, you can make a difference, that it is simple, that it is easy to understand, and it doesn't involve anything complicated. It doesn't involve a great deal of knowledge about nutrition, in fact, and it doesn't involve a lot of expense. So I want to talk about what to feed, how to feed, and even how much to feed, and that seems to be a big problem for a lot of people. Another issue we will address is the safety issue, because I know that's of great concern. We did an online chat last night, and that seemed to be a big issue, and it is a big issue when we have question times. The other thing I want to say about feeding dogs the raw diet, that it is exceedingly adaptable. Today, people are being besieged with the idea that if they have a pregnant dog, or a lactating dog, or a working dog, that the feeding of those dogs is a vastly different affair, and that you have to use entirely different foods. Well, actually, you have to use exactly the same foods that you feed to your ordinary, at home, not doing very much, maintaining type of dog. It's just that you vary the proportions around. And I'm going to show you towards the end a very simple mechanism, or a very simple way of feeding, which we use at home with our dogs and which can be adapted to any situation. Now I just want to begin with a very quick overview of, first of all, the options we have for feeding dogs today, and then just a few of the philosophies behind those options. Now, of course, in fact, we only have really two basic options. One is to go out and buy your dog food, and as I understand it in America, that would mean about 90% of the people who feed dogs. In Australia, that probably means about 60% of the people who feed dogs. The other option is to produce something at home. Now, that sounds like it ought to be pretty easy. You feed yourselves. Well, for a lot of people it's really scary. And there are two choices when you're feeding from home. One is to cook the food for your dog, and the other is to feed it raw. For most people that's not even a choice. There is no question you should cook the food. I'm here to change your mind on that one. What are the philosophies behind all this? Well, a lot of people believe that feeding dogs is excessively difficult and best left to the experts. I'm here to tell you that that philosophy is absolute rubbish. Well, and I'll show you why in just a second. A lot of people, some people, but not many, believe feeding home food is simply more healthy, but they don't know how to do it. While I've been over here, I've come across two books that say we should look at the background of each breed over the last 1,000 years or so, the way it was developed, how it was fed while it was developing, and that is the way we should be feeding our dogs today. Now that sounds like a pretty valid approach, and there is a lot of good sense in it. What's my philosophy? My philosophy goes back a little bit further in time. My philosophy is that we should be looking at the way dogs in the wild are eating and feeding our dogs that way. And I'm going to explain fully why. Well, as much as we can in this short period of time. Now, why do I want to do that? As a veterinary surgeon, I see unhealth in dogs. And I see unhealth in dogs being fed particular foods. And I see health in dogs being fed other foods. The greatest health I see is when I observe dogs that are fed their natural diet, or as close as we can get to it. Because I'm asking the question continually of my clients, what do you feed your dog? And it's very simple to correlate what the clients are feeding with the health of their dog. And I'm very fortunate living in Australia that I've seen this situation go from a time when we fed probably 80 to 90% raw foods and home produced foods to a time when we're feeding perhaps 60 to 70% processed foods. So I've seen the change in the health of the dogs. And this is called epidemiology, the study of changing patterns of disease over time. So I'm in that very fortunate position of having seen it, and this is what I'm sharing with you. Two things that are really important. If you want to have a healthy dog, and hey, if you want to be healthy yourselves, think about this. One, most of the food you should feed your dog, and preferably yourself, should be raw. I'll show you why in a moment. Secondly, most of the food should not be based on carbohydrates. Rule out the carbohydrates, rule out excessive cooking, and your dog is going to be excessively healthy, bounding out of its skin. And it's very simple. Why is it so? Well, I want to take you back about 2 million years. That's a hell of a long time, isn't it? But you can cope. It shatters us a bit when we think of long periods of time like that, because it hits upon our mortality, doesn't it? But let's go back there anyway, to Paleolithic man. The beginnings of man. Man at that stage was a hunter-gatherer. And let me tell you what he ate. English is a bit bad there. What he ate back then, 2 million years ago. Very simple. He ate other animals, mammals, he ate fish, and he ate fowl. He ate vegetables, fruit, and nuts. And that's it. All of it was raw, and not 1 ounce of it was cooked grain. And there was certainly no sugar in there. That's very important. That process continued until about 100,000 years ago. Now that's a long time, and that's the evolutionary adaptation of man till about 100,000 years ago. And it was in a tropical setting that this occurred. And at the same time, the dog was evolving. But dog and man were not friends at this time. About 100,000 years ago, the climates began to change, and the climates became more temperate. And man had to evolve some technologies, but not very great technologies. What were they? Number one, he had to develop some clothes. So they were the furs of animals. And two, to keep warm, he also had to develop fire. So over the next perhaps 90,000 years, man began to dry out food over fire and maybe begin to cook a little bit, but not a lot. He was still eating other animals, fish, fowl, vegetables, fruit and nuts. And guess who was coming into his life at this time? Because he was out on the plains hunting, he met a fellow hunter. That fellow hunter was the wolf and other dog-like creatures. And together they would hunt. It took a long, long time for this symbiotic relationship to develop. But think about this. We have been with our friend the dogs for a long, long time. And over that period of time, a process was taking place. We call it neoteny. It's a process by which we tend to hang on to childlike traits. Traits like humour and laughter and friendliness and fun and games. All the things that make us, modern humans, nice to know, and all the things that make our friend the dog nice to have with us. And we were developing this unique bond between man and dog. And at the same time, we were sharing pretty well precisely the same foods as we hunted. It all began with man chasing dogs off this food and sometimes eating the dog's dinner, as it were, and the dogs sharing the aftermath of man's food. Now, this changed about 10,000 years ago because man and dog had actually driven most of the species they were eating to extinction. There was a major problem. But it was okay. Man had solved the problem because he had found out from his cooking fires that some of those grains dropped into the fire in some way or another, they became excellent food. And so man became a grain eater. He also became a legume eater, and he started eating things like potatoes cooked and other sources of carbohydrates. And you know, this ushered in a period called the Neolithic era. And at that time, it was observed, and is observed by scientists who look at these things, that the stature of man dropped 6 inches. And that was simply by changing his diet. Now this is important. He changed his diet from a hunter-gatherer to a farmer. Stature of man in general, the world over, dropped about 6 inches. For the first time, the fossil records show that man was developing tooth decay and degenerative disease. Was the dog? We believe not. Over the next 10,000 years or so, the dog and man continued to live together, developing that bond, and the breeds were developing. Mostly the dog continued to eat the way he'd always eaten, dependent upon man and eating the scraps from the table. Lots of bones, lots of raw food. About at the tops, somewhere between 7 and 30 generations ago, there came a change in the dog's eating habits. And with that change, I've been documenting changes in the way dogs' health has been. Dogs' health has declined. And I've seen it very much so in Australia over the last 7 generations, as dogs have changed from a diet based largely on bones and raw foods, vegetables, human food scraps, to a diet based largely on carbohydrates and cooked. I've seen that compression in time. And in the last, I suppose, 10 years, and people are coming up to me with this epidemiological evidence, with the increase of heat-damaged polyunsaturated fats in the diets of our modern dogs, we're seeing an enormous increase in the range of autoimmune disease. Now there's another factor going on there that some people are incriminating, and that is vaccination, and that's a whole other issue, but it's actually related, because the whole thing is related to the immune systems of our dogs. Let me also say at this time, the people I'm meeting over here who are actually giving this idea a go and finding their dogs to be so much healthier and so much better, they are the beginning, I believe, of quite a strong wave that is going to make a difference to the health of the modern dog in Western society. They are going to make more difference than all the drug companies, all us vets put together, because all us vets are doing is treating the results of poor diet. And you can actually make a difference, a far bigger difference to the health of the dogs. Let me talk to you briefly now about some fears in people's minds, or some myths, if you will. These are the 6 myths that prevent a lot of people from feeding their dogs properly and having healthy dogs. Let's look at the first problem area, as I see it, in people's minds. People tend to believe that the modern dog cannot eat raw food, that it cannot eat like its wild ancestor. And there are some modern books, some very good modern books out now that say that. Well, the first thing I have to say to these people is this: if we go back 100,000 years, there are 20,000 generations. If 5 years is a dog's generation, 20,000 generations of dogs that have evolved eating raw food. It is biologically impossible to change a dog's genetic background to that extent in about 7 to 15 generations, which is in reality what we're claiming. Genetics, evolution doesn't work that way. There is no scientific evidence, there are no scientifically controlled trials to say your dog cannot eat raw food. There is enormous evidence, enormous epidemiological evidence to suggest your dog can eat raw food, and I see the results of that every day, as do, I guess, thousands of people, probably more than that, tens of thousands of people who have tried to feed their dogs this way and have been shockingly and pleasantly surprised. A friend of mine, she's a friend now, I didn't know her till about a month ago, tells me the story when she first started out. The dog was there, finger was on the speed dial to the vet, and the chicken wing was up here. And her friends were gathered round for moral and whatever else support was required. The chicken wing was dropped, the dog ate it, and guess what? Nothing happened. The dog survived. And so she continues and has adopted this way of feeding. Now, she's not the first person to do that. She's not the first person to be afraid. So that first myth or lie I want you to entirely dispel from your minds. Yes, the dog is still able to eat raw food. The next myth is really related to the same thing, and it's this: dogs should not eat bones. Their system cannot handle it. Well, even in the worst case scenario, our dogs have only been not eating bones for about 7 to 15 generations. They have been eating bones, just as a partner of man, for somewhere between 10 and 20,000 generations. In my experience, from a toy poodle, a papillon, a chihuahua, a French bulldog, right through to a Great Dane, no difference. They can all eat a raw, meaty bone, as long as it's raw. And that's really the very essential fact that you've got to get into your mind. It must be raw. Another problem that is in people's minds is that dog feeding is very difficult. Well, I'm here to tell you it's absurdly simple. In fact, I can tell you in probably 2 minutes and about 5 lines how to do it, how we do it. And I'm going to show you that right at the end with a few slides. It is absurdly simple. And it doesn't require a higher degree in nutrition to do it. If you go around to your veterinary surgeon, he is so afraid of advising you that he won't even try to advise you. He'll say, go out and buy such and such a brand of dog food. Now that may or may not be good advice, but what I'm telling you is you don't have to worry. You can bypass that whole scenario and just start feeding your dog the way people used to in America probably 60 years ago, and in Australia about 30 years ago. What I want to do now is take you through the elements of feeding our dogs. And let's begin by talking about the raw, meaty bones, this terribly vexed issue in people's minds. What are the advantages of bones? Well, first of all, number one, the most important, they are a biologically appropriate way of feeding dogs. Now, have you heard the expression that has become a little bit sort of surrounding me, the BARF diet? B-A-R-F? Some of you have? Who hasn't heard of the BARF diet? Oh, quite a few. Okay. Well, This phrase was coined in America, and it started out as a bit of a sling-off at people who were feeding this way, as the born-again raw feeders. Then this particular person actually tried it, and then she changed that acronym to Bones and Raw Food Diet. Now a lot of people say to me, which is what we're talking about here, the Bones and Raw Food Diet. A lot of people say to me, what about when you're feeding the natural diet? Then they start having a go. And I want you to forget the word natural. And with that bones and raw food diet, think of this one also. In fact, you might write this one down, because this is probably even more apt to the situation. What we are attempting to feed here is a dog's biologically appropriate raw food diet, BARF. This is what God, nature, or evolution, if you will, designed dogs to eat. Evolution, God, or nature, whichever way you want to put it, did not design dogs to eat cooked grain, which is the basis of modern dog feeding efforts. It's like if you take a car and you put in the wrong spare parts, the wrong fuel, and the wrong lubrication, it's not going to take long for that car to start to break down. But if you look after that car and service it according to the manufacturer's recommendations, you're going to find that that car lasts you. It will not break down. It will not become diseased. If we can service our dogs according to the manufacturer's recommendations, exactly the same thing's going to happen. And the basis is bones. Well, because there are a few words associated with this diet. Our dog is a hunter. So think about this. Our dog is a scavenger. What do those two things mean? It means that first of all, dogs eat bones, and they have done for many thousands of years. Your dog is an opportunist. You know that. If your dog gets the opportunity to raid the garbage can or the cat litter box, he will, and she will. That also comes down to this. Your dog is an omnivore. But one thing I'd like to add to that, your dog can eat a whole lot more, because your dog can eat rotten and revolting food. As a vet, I know that all too well. As a vet, we have to pull out dead foals, afterbirths, all sorts of things out of animals that shouldn't have them inside, but they do, and we have to correct them. Usually it's done out on a farm or in a field somewhere. Usually there's a few farm dogs hanging around. And you picture one really smelly, revolting, dead foal inside a horse, been there a week. As it comes out, the vet who's pulling it is covered with this foul, fetid material. People holding the horse are vomiting. People are running in all directions. It smells that bad. Hit the ground. What are the dogs doing? Are they running in another direction? They're straight on it. Have we lost sound? So dogs aren't quite like us, and in fact that's why the BARF acronym is so beautifully appropriate for our dogs. I mean, you know yourself, perhaps you don't. No, perhaps we shouldn't tell the story about coming home from that party and the dogs crowding around that very sick person. Perhaps a more appropriate and nicer tale is when you come home and your pups lick your face. What are they asking you to do? They're asking you to barf for them, because that's what mum or dad or one member of the wolf pack would do for them. So dogs are able to eat pretty rotten, revolting food. It gets worse than this end. As I've already mentioned, dogs also eat the other end. Dogs are feces eaters. So that's another example of dogs' tendency to eat rotten and revolting food. What do bones supply that is so wonderful? Now, most people know that bones will pacify a dog. I mean, we all know that dogs eat bones. We've got nursery rhymes, for goodness sake, that tell us that dogs eat bones. We've got vets that tell us they shouldn't in both countries. Although we've changed a bit over the last 5 to 10 years. Vets in Australia will now say feed them bone once a week to keep their teeth clean. They stress not to do it more often. I'm not sure why. Maybe because it would make them too healthy. I suspect so. No, I don't really believe we're that mercenary. At least I hope we're not. Yes, they're good pacifiers. Yes, they do keep the teeth clean. And I'll show you a slide of some teeth in a minute that didn't eat bones. The fact that dogs eat bones and love it is great for their psyche. And this is terribly important too. You'll see this at zoos. When everybody's gone home, the gates are closed and nobody can watch, the large cats and the wild dogs are throwing things like dead chickens, goats, cows, and they then get into that food and eat it as they would in the wild, and that includes the bones. Why? Because it's good for their psyche. Actually, what the zoo half the time doesn't realise, it's actually very good nutrition as well. And this is the next point about bones. They are brilliant nutrition for your dog. They are brilliant nutrition for your dog. The most important nutrition they supply, particularly to a growing puppy, is its complete source of calcium and phosphorus in perfect balance, with perfect calcium-phosphorus ratio, which so many people are concerned about. And in fact, when it comes to puppy feeding, you don't have to worry. You can feed 20% of the diet as raw meaty bones, or 90% of the diet as raw meaty bones, and you will get exactly the right amount of calcium and phosphorus being absorbed. No problems. Numerous scientific trials have shown that, on the other hand, if you take a commercial dog food that has too much calcium, or you throw in an artificial calcium, such as calcium carbonate, whatever, if you make that mistake by overdoing the calcium, you can actually create bone disease in that young dog. And I'm talking about things like hip and elbow dysplasia. So number one, it's the perfect source of minerals, particularly calcium and phosphorus, but not only calcium and phosphorus. In fact, the whole range of minerals, because they're stored in the bone. But it's not only minerals that the bone supplies. The bone is a beautiful source of first-class protein. Now, isn't that wonderful? We're getting minerals and protein supplied. What else does it supply? Well, certainly in the marrow of the bones, the blood-forming elements. It supplies energy, because not only is there protein, not only is there minerals, but there's also fat. Now, if you take the right sort of bone, that fat can be largely composed of some essential fatty acids. Now, what is that left for us to feed? Well, very little, because guess what? The protein also contains high levels of the B vitamins. The fats contain the fat-soluble vitamins. And the joy of this thing is, I discovered years ago, and this was just purely by accident and my laziness. We used to rescue lots of young pups for all breeds. We couldn't put them down when they had to be put down, and this was happening a lot back then. It doesn't happen as much now, but I guess the cosmos, God, the universe, whatever, arranges things for us to learn. And what it taught me was those dogs lived at our place. We had very little time for them, but it was about this time that I discovered the importance of bones. So they used to get thrown mostly from sheep and some parts of chickens, chicken wings, chicken necks, sheep shanks, that's hard to say when you've been speaking for a while, sheep shanks and other parts of offcuts. That's what these dogs ate, and a few vegetable leftovers, and they were absurdly healthy. What I discovered very early on, that a raw meaty bone, far from being a very deficient sort of diet, was almost a complete diet. Now there's something else, another myth that I forgot to dispel from your minds, which is so important that just speaking here has reminded me. This is so important, it sounds like God, mother and country. You should believe it. And this is a myth about feeding dogs. This is something that you probably, most people, think is absolutely important, and that is this. Most people want to believe that every meal you feed your dog should be complete and balanced. Well, that, again, is absolute rubbish. You don't feed yourselves that way. If you're mothers and fathers, you haven't fed your children that way, you're not feeding yourself that way. If you did try to do that, you'd be an absolute mess trying to figure out whether today's lunch had the right levels of selenium and magnesium and calcium and phosphorus and iodine and essential fatty acids and proteins. You don't do it for yourself and you survive. You don't have to do it for your dog either. The dog hasn't been fed that way for millions of years, only for the last few generations. What do you have to do? You balance the whole diet over a period of weeks, if you will. And that's the joy of feeding this way. Because you can feed a raw meaty bone meal today and a mostly vegetable meal tomorrow. You'll be saying, my dogs won't eat vegetables. Yes, they will. I'll show you how. The next thing is offal. Well, we don't call it offal over here, we call it organ meat. Liver, kidneys, hearts, all that sort of thing. Why are they so good? Let me tell you. In the first place, they are biologically appropriate. They are what dogs have eaten for a long time. What do they supply? Let me tell you quickly. First-class protein, essential fatty acids, high levels of vitamin A and other minerals, other vitamins, particularly the B vitamins, and many minerals with the exception of calcium, but of course that's made up for by the bones. By the way, just a little plug for my book here. All of this information is in my book. Moving on. I want to talk to you now about something which is so vitally important and which so many dogs do not get. It is such a vital component of your dog's life, or it should be, that is the major reason why so many dogs are lacking health today, why their immune systems are down. It's this. We should be feeding our dogs vegetables. What a bore, I hear you say. Vegetables. Dogs don't like vegetables. Dogs can't digest vegetables. Let me tell you a quick story. If you drive along the roads in Australia, particularly during certain times of the year, spring and autumn for example, there are lots of kangaroos crossing the roads looking for other kangaroos. They're looking to reproduce. Well, a lot of them suffer from what we call Mack truck disease, and they end up in the table drain by the side of the road. Now we just happen to have, in some areas, some pretty poor dog control laws. We also have some foxes and the occasional dingo. And what you'll see, those dogs, those wild canids, will come along and open up the paunch of the kangaroo. The first thing they will eat is the intestinal contents, masses of vegetation. Then they'll attack things like the liver and the hearts and the kidneys. What's going on? These dogs are eating vegetables. Why? Well, they need it. The vegetables supply such a broad range of important foods or important nutrients. And they're raw. We didn't actually get to the importance of rawness, but when you cook something, you destroy so many nutrients. You destroy enzymes. In the case of plants, you destroy phytochemicals. You destroy lots of vitamins. What's special about the guts of an animal, if you'll excuse that expression? Well, the vegetables in it have been totally crushed. To feed vegetables to your dogs, it's no good feeding them cooked because you've destroyed so much of the nutrients in it. It's not biologically appropriate. It's no good feeding them cut up into chunks. It's not even any good to feed them grated, because even in a grated piece of vegetable, that whole grated piece will pass through undigested. Why? Because plants, and this is the value of a degree in agricultural science, 4 years have led me to this, folks. Plants are composed of cells, and each cell is surrounded by a cellulose cell wall, and dogs cannot digest cellulose. So even grated, you leave the vast majority of those cells locked up, unable to be touched by your dog's digestive system. The answer is simple. Do something very biologically appropriate. Crush it. Simplest way, put it through a juicer. Have some of the juice yourself. Take the pulp that's left over and feed that to your dog. My dog won't eat it. Yes, your dog will, and I'll show you in a moment just exactly how your dog will eat that. You have to crush the vegetables. Now what I'm going to show you now is just a few pictures of the way we feed our dogs. And this also is outlined in my second book, which is called Grow Your Pups with Bones. First book was called Give Your Dog a Bone. We ran out of ideas for the title for the second book, so we came very close. That's not true. It's just that the second book deals with the bones and raw food diet, which is a simpler way of explaining this diet, which I'm going to show you on here. It also deals with feeding dogs for breeding, so it's good for breeders. And the third part deals with the orthopedic diseases in young dogs. Okay. But what's important here is vegetables. They must be fed to our dogs. I'll just come down here now, we'll turn this on. And if we can just have that other, thank you very much. Can we kill the house lights? Is that possible?
Yeah, sorry.
Can't do that? Oh well.
They're in the attic.
Can't have everything. That, folks, is a dog. It's a sick dog, and it was probably euthanized shortly after that was taken. That dog had congestive heart failure, but the only reason I put it there is to represent the many dogs today who are dying of degenerative disease because of the food they eat. Now, it's probably very hard to see in this light, but if you look very carefully, that there is a tooth. So is that, and so is that. That's about one of the last back teeth that are left on this dog. It is actually covered with tartar. That's a dog that didn't eat any bones during its life, and it had a totally poisoned mouth because of it. A totally poisoned system. Let's quickly look at this BARF diet, bones and raw food. How do we go about it? So very simple. Did you get the handout? Well, that's a bit miserable, isn't it? Well, you should go out and speak to Kathleen about this. I thought that she should have this for you. This is the basic bones and raw food diet, just one sheet, and it can be used to modify for any situation. So speak to Kathleen, she'll love you when you do that. But she will get it for you. Now what it is, hopefully I was hoping you'd have it in front of you, but there are just two components. Let's move to those components. Number one, raw meaty bones. These are chicken wings. These are chicken wings that have just been taken out of the freezer. And by the way, it's biologically appropriate to freeze a dog's food because the wolves have been eating that way. They've been digging up frozen food for hundreds of thousands of years. So the freezer is biologically appropriate, the stove is not. These have been taken out of the freezer and dropped on a hard concrete floor to break them up. Now the next bit is not biologically appropriate in that we thaw them out often in the microwave. But let's face it, we have to do a little bit of technology these days. Oh, that's just a pup eating bones. It can happen. And again. Oh, our dogs love bones. This is a little dog, our dog Ellie, and she's going off to go and clean her teeth and eat the cartilage off the ends of bones to help her not have arthritis and to help her not get cancer. This is very important. What have we got here? We can just hold. Up the top you'll see celery, then you'll see some carrot there, celery, carrot and apples. And over here is a juicer and over there is a blender. A better view, that's our juicer, a centrifugal juicer. That's probably one of the most important tools you can have if you want to feed your dog this way. Well, the question I've just been asked, can you use a blender or a food processor? Yes, you can. Sometimes, though, the vegetable pulp from a blender or a food processor becomes a little bit wet, in which case you just squeeze out the juice. Or if you're using one of these centrifugal food processors, you just make the juice. And you can see it's filling up here. Where are we? That's just a cup filling up with the juice. We're actually, I'm sorry these are so difficult to see. The next slide is very important. This is the pulp. Now in these patties which we make for our dogs, now we feed it, this is the way we do it, we feed our dogs the raw meaty bones in the morning and the patties in the afternoon. How do we make the patties? Very simple. They are made of this vegetable pulp. Now because it's been crushed, it's able to be used by the dog's intestines. And this is what we add in. We add in such things as eggs, we add in flaxseed oil, there's the pulp, some ground mince, things like yogurt, kelp powder, some B vitamins. We form these up into meal-sized patties. Now, if you've got a Great Dane or a St. Bernard, those meal-sized patties may translate into shopping bags full. If you've got a miniature Chihuahua, if there is such a thing, they might translate into ice cubes in an ice tray. Doesn't really matter. For our dogs, little handfuls, which our dogs are little Jack Russell Terriers. We freeze those, it's very convenient. We bring them out, we thaw them out, and they eat them that way. Now the joy of this system is, and I know we're rushing through this because we haven't got a lot of time, is that you can vary the proportions of this. And once you've done this, by throwing in, if you're using chicken wings for example, I've already explained that bones are the perfect source and almost a complete diet with their minerals, their proteins and their fats. You can vary this whole diet around. If for example you were feeding a lactating bitch, then you're going to feed the chicken wings in large amounts because of the calcium content of the bones. And by the way, chicken wings have the ideal proportion between bones and protein, or between bones and muscle and fat. And then when you're making these patties up, with the pulp, you cut the pulp down and you increase the ground mince. And the ground mince, in fact, consists of chicken wings. So again, you're incorporating that calcium. And also, in addition to what's there, as well as the B vitamins, you might throw in some liver for all the extra components in that. So you can vary this very easily. If you have a dog with kidney failure, then you're going to increase the amount of vegetable material in the patties, and you're going to cut down on the level of raw meaty bones because you're going to cut down protein. What you're not going to do is add in lots of grain to this diet at any stage. If you've got a dog that's losing weight, then you use more fatty mince or a more fattier source of raw meaty bones. If you've got a dog that needs to lose weight, then less fat, very lean mince, less bones in fact, because bones are a high source of fat. And you're going to increase the vegetables. What you're doing is you're not feeding rubbish food at any stage. Every bit of food you feed is of good value, high quality. You're just varying the components, and if you understand the principles, it's so very easy. So really what I want to do today is encourage you, just with this very brief introduction, to think seriously about feeding your dog the raw diet. If you do, you will experience, as so many others, that health problems will start to disappear. And I want to emphasise it is very, very safe. I guess we've got time for about 5 minutes worth of questions. Yes, down the front. Okay, the question was, what about pancreatitis and arthritis? Okay, with pancreatitis, inflammation of the pancreas, we start off on very low-fat diets, high vegetable diets. And then we move slowly to a diet that it will never be high in fat and will always be high in vegetables. Because these dogs are invariably overweight, or almost invariably overweight. A very similar diet for arthritis. It was arthritis, wasn't it? Yep. With arthritis, beautiful. Lots of vegetables, no red meat or white meat. We cut out the deadly nightshade group and the citrus group of fruits. And by the way, fruit's very important too. Full of enzymes, good for our dogs. And it's very important in arthritis. We don't have time to discuss these fully. The arthritis diet will also be high in flaxseed oil. You'll throw in things like cartilage from bovine tracheas or shark. The bovine trachea is actually better and it's cheaper. Yes? Okay, the question is, and this is a very important question, something we didn't manage to cover, the problem of Salmonella, E. coli, Campylobacter and those sort of things. In Australia, we find that's not a problem. One of the reasons, I believe, and people in America, as they adopt this diet, are not finding the problem because these foods raise the immune system. Also, the dog is designed to eat foods rich in bacteria. And a prime example, of course, is faeces. Yes? Sorry, I can't hear you.
I'm not so much concerned about bacteria, but of tick-borne diseases such as ehrlichiosis, babesiosis, Lyme disease. 60% of the deer in Texas are Lyme positive.
Okay, all right. Now, when you know that a particular source of food carries a particular disease, look to another source. That's the important thing. Don't use it if you know it carries it. Yes? Okay. Okay, so there is a problem with your food sources, with the residues. Sadly, that is all ending up in processed food. One of the joys about feeding your dogs yourself is you have control and you can go out and source healthy sources. And that's what I'd strongly suggest you do. And for yourselves, that lady out there. Well, this lady wants to see scientific rather than anecdotal. Let me tell you this. We vets, when I was a student, the most preeminent scientist, probably veterinary scientist in America, Dr. Robert Kirk, said the best way you can learn about nutrition is to ask your clients of healthy dogs, who own healthy dogs, what they feed their dogs. And that's precisely what I've been doing. I believe that we are looking at lifetime feeding trials, and I believe that is a very scientific way to go about it. The put down of anecdotal is indeed just that, a put down and an excuse not to get our dogs healthy. I think we've run out of time. It is now past. I thank you for your attention.